All right, so we're going to continue our look at Jacob through, again, a story that's well known to us, but one I think that you will see there's still so many, and I suppose this is the thing that I love about the story of Jacob. We do know the story about this man, but there's so many relevant, practical stories that come out of this lesson that we can learn for ourselves. And I find it interesting that these events occurred thousands of years ago in cultures that are completely different to our own, in cities hundreds and thousands of kilometres away, yet at the core of them, they're just the same as us, aren't they? And they're facing just the same decisions and family problems and relationship problems that we are facing here in 2018. And isn't that beautiful, the way God writes the record in that way, that it remains just as relevant now as it did then. Now, tonight we're going to be looking at Syrian life, and we talked about last night how this is one of the major themes of Jacob's life. He's going to have to purge the Syrian from his life. And we looked at Syria as being really a type of the world and all the aspirations of the world and the characteristics of the world. And this man would have to learn to purge those from his life. And in this study tonight, Jacob will come face to face with Syria. And he'll have to make some choices about which way and which direction he will go in life. And we'll all face those same decisions about the direction in which our life will ultimately lead. And so therefore, of course, there's some powerful lessons for all of us in this story. Now, we left Jacob this afternoon running away from his brother Esau, who was determined to take his life. And so he would have left scared, wouldn't he? And he would have left, as we said, thinking, what has life got for me now? I'd mapped out where I thought life was going to go. And now life has moved in a completely different direction. But God was very much looking after this man and guiding his steps and guiding his paths. And we see that from verse 11, of chapter 28. And we'll quickly look at chapter 28, where Jacob has this amazing vision that God gives to him. And as Jacob was running, it says in verse 10 that Jacob went from Beersheba and he ran towards Haran. So he didn't know exactly where he was going to go that night, but he was making his way up to his uncle Laban's house. And verse 11 says that he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all that night because the sun was set. Now, the record in that verse mentions this certain place 3 times. He took the stones of that place and he put them for his pillows, and he lay down in that place to sleep. And God is telling us that he didn't just come to a random spot that night, but that God was working to this man and he came to the place that God wanted to come to. And the sun went down on this man's journey at exactly the place where God wanted him to come that night. It's interesting that the sun goes down here on Jacob's life, because we'll see tomorrow that the sun will rise again later in chapter 32 on Jacob's life. And between the sun setting and the sun rising, Jacob will learn some very, very key lessons in his life, and they will actually set the direction of where he will go for the rest of his life and his family go as well. But he comes to the place. And it's the place called, as we find out later in this chapter, Bethel. Now, we've heard about this place before because Abraham came to this place. Come back to Genesis chapter 13. Or Genesis chapter 12. And this is when Abraham first came into the land. God had called Abraham out of the world and said, I want to work with you, Abraham, to work with your life and to shape you into someone that I want to be. And Abraham answered that call. He said, I'm interested in you, God. And didn't Jacob do the same thing? I'm interested in you, God, and I want to move towards you in my life. And both of them come to this certain place, and it was Bethel. God's house. And in verse 8, Abraham comes to that place after journeying all the way from Ur, after finally leaving his family behind. And it says, "And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai in the east. And there in that place he built an altar unto Yahweh, and he called upon the name of Yahweh." And this is where Abraham, at this time, it says there, he called upon the name of Yahweh. And this is where Abraham began his relationship with God. He'd answered God's call, but now he's there in the land, and he will develop and now grow a personal relationship with his God. And he signified that by building an altar in that place. And Jacob now comes to that very place, and he picks up a stone, and who knows, maybe that very stone was one of the stones that Abraham used to make that altar. And he lied down in that place, and now Jacob is going to begin his spiritual relationship with God. And it's going to be personal now. And we've been talking the whole way, haven't we, about how Jacob's life is a process of how we grow towards God. And one of the most important parts of our relationship of God, and a point that we'll all get to, is that our personal relationship with God must become personal. Our parents teach us about God, don't they? Our Sunday school teachers teach us all the lessons about God and all those things, and they hope that we'll take them on in our life. But at some point, we've got to do that. And we begin at that point a personal relationship with God. And we start to pray to God about our life and about our issues. And we begin over the course of our life to develop and become closer to our God. And this is what Jacob does here. Now, God, at the start of this relationship, comes to Jacob and he assures him of some things. And we know this story so well, but perhaps we can just become blasé about what its meaning is. Verse 12 of Genesis chapter 28. God gives Jacob that famous vision. He dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on earth, and the top of it stretched to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. So he goes to that bed that night on that rock, and he has this amazing vision. And here, someone's actually created it for us in 3D. Okay? There he is on the rock, and he has this vision of this ladder. And God was trying to, in a very simple way, because God knows that we're pretty simple sometimes, he wanted to demonstrate to him how he was going to work and be with him in life. And so he visually represented to Jacob, he said, what I'm doing from here on, Jacob, this is how much I love you and how much I care for you in every point that your life will go to this point. He said, I've set up a ladder right next to you. And I've set it up. And it goes from you all the way up to heaven. And I've got my angels, my ministering spirits, who are going up and down that ladder right next to your life. And they're involved in your life. And they care about your life. Now, I think that's hard sometimes for us to appreciate. We can look at Jacob or we can look at Abraham and all these people of the past and think, yeah, God was working in their life, but is God really working in my life? And God says it's exactly the same. God has set up next to your life a ladder, and it goes from your life up to his, up and back. And that is how much God cares and is looking after our needs. And he knew all about Jacob. He knew about the ups and downs that would come upon his life. And he made a promise to Jacob here, and the promise is in verse 15. Of course, he gave him the blessing in verse 13 and 14. But then he gives him a promise in verse 15, which is very personal to Jacob. Verse 15 says, "And behold, I am with you, and will keep you in all the places that you go, and I will bring you again unto this land. For I will not leave you until I have done that which I have spoken of you. So God promises from this point and assures Jacob absolute care in his life. In every aspect of his life, God says, I will be there for you. When you have down points in your life, I will be there. When you have great joy in your life, I will be there. And you don't have to worry, because I'll always be there to guide you and to bring you. And God says, I'm not just in it for like a week or 2 weeks. He says, until I have done that which I have spoken of you. So God was in it for the long haul in Jacob's life, and he's in it for the long haul in our own life. He is there to guide us and direct us right back, or right to the point where he wants us to. And he assured Jacob of this, and he assures us of this as well in our own lives. Now, once Jacob is given this promise, he makes a vow to God, and he does that in verse 20. After seeing what God had promised him, he says in verse 20, and Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in the way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall Yahweh be my God. So Jacob looks at everything that God has promised him and says, if this is what God has promised me, then God is going to be my God. Now, sometimes it can read as though what Jacob is saying there is he's making a bargain with God. And he's saying, okay, God, you've promised me that you're going to work with me in my life, and you're going to be bringing me from this stage all the way through and bringing me to this point in my life. Well, if you say that you're going to do that, if you can prove that to me, then you'll be my God. But I don't think Jacob is doing that. I think Jacob is taking what God has said on face value and saying, if that's the kind of God that you're going to be, if you're going to be a God that looks after me and guides me through my life, then you are going to be my God, and I'm going to commit my way to you. So at this point, as he sets out to his new life in Syria, Jacob commits his life to God. And it's almost like chapter 28 is Jacob's baptism. He commits his way to God, and God says, I will be with you and I will take you, even though your life might go through ups and downs. I am going to bring you to where I want you to. I will assure you of that. And that's what God says to Jacob. And now he embarks upon this new life that he'll embark on in Syria. So verse 1 of chapter 29. And Jacob went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, there was a well in the field, and there were 3 flocks of sheep. There was 3 flocks of sheep lying by it, for out of that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was upon the well's mouth. So this man leaves that dream behind, and he keeps running and running the next day, and eventually he comes to this well. And it's in the land of Haran. And he sees these people around these well, all these shepherds. And we get a picture here of the kind of man that Jacob was, all right? We looked at the first study how sometimes he's depicted as a plain man, a bit of a boring man. But Jacob wasn't like that at all. He's a confident man, and he comes across really confident and self-assured when he comes to Laban's household in Syria. Look what he does in verse 5. When he comes across these shepherds that are at the well, he says, and he said unto them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, yeah, okay, we know him. And he then says in verse 6, and he said unto them, is he well? And they said, he is well, and behold, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. And then Jacob says this in verse 7, and he said, lo, it is yet high day, neither is it time for that the cattle should be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them. So Jacob arrived, he's been here for 5 minutes, he's seen these shepherds around the well, and already he's telling them completely what to do. He says, what are you guys doing? Like, it's not the time for... You should be feeding your sheep, watering your sheep at the well, and then getting out to pasture as quick as possible. So he tells these people what they should be doing. And he's been there for 5 minutes. And this is the type of man that Jacob was at this point. He's confident in himself. He's self-assured. He knows what he wants. He's been a shepherd down with his father's house, and now he's going to assert that upon the new house of Laban. Now, why he's speaking to these shepherds, verse 9 goes on to say, and while he spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. So he's talking to these shepherds and then around the well, and Rachel walks past with her sheep. And the record writes as if he's talking to the shepherds, and as soon as he saw Rachel, he just completely lost interest in what the shepherds had to say, and he was just transfixed by this beautiful woman, Rachel. He couldn't believe the beauty of this woman. While he was still speaking to them, he's transfixed by this woman, Rachel. And verse 10 goes on to say that he suddenly becomes motivated after seeing this woman. And it says, and it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and he watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So as soon as he saw this beautiful girl, suddenly he gets all this energy and he runs across to that well and he rolls that stone over and he gets all the water for all of the shepherds and all of the sheep that were there. It reminds me of like when we used to go to Hebron and you'd have all the young people there and then someone would bring out a football, okay? And it was like in that main sort of area where everyone is. And as soon as that football came out, all the boys suddenly were straight out onto that flat and they were just trying to do the most amazing moves to impress the girls, right? That's what it was like here for Laban. And people have always, I suppose people throughout history, men have always done that. I remember Josh. Where is Josh? There he is, right there. He used to have interesting techniques. I remember he used to have a unicycle, right? Everyone else would be out kicking the football and then Josh would come out with a unicycle, right, riding around. And it was very successful, mind you, very successful method. Extremely successful. Right? But men have had their methods, haven't they? And it's about impressing the women. And this is what Jacob did. He comes out of this well and he rolls the stone away. And all of a sudden, Rachel takes notice of this man. Now, it's interesting. There's actually a correlation between... You might recognise that story from the story of Moses. Remember Moses did the same thing? He ran away from Pharaoh because he'd killed that Egyptian. And he ran all day. And he came to a well. And there were some beautiful women there. And he chased away all the rest of the shepherds. And he fed those sheep. And there's a correlation here actually between the man Jacob and the man Moses. Both of them have got to learn the same lesson. About not confidence in themselves, but about confidence in God. And at this point, this man Jacob is extremely confident in his own ability. And he wants to impress this beautiful woman, Rachel. Now, the record emphasises in verse 10, it emphasises this man Laban 3 times. You probably would have noticed. It says he comes across, verse 10, we'll read it again. It came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And the record is trying to tell us that Jacob had on his mind Laban, his mother's brother. And he'd heard so much about Laban, his mother's brother. He'd heard about it from his mother, Rebecca. She'd told him about her uncle, Laban, and everything that he had done. And Jacob was interested in Laban and his household and Syria. And now he's there and he's going to see Laban, his mother's brother, and everything he was and everything that he represented. And Jacob arrives in Haran excited about the possibilities of Syria. about what laid ahead in this land for him, these opportunities, this new place, a career that he could pave for himself. All this life in Syria was ahead of him. Now, I suppose that relates to our own life. When we're young, and I suppose I've just recently turned 40, so I'm probably at the point where I'm not young anymore. But I suppose in our youth, we look at the possibilities of Syria, and there's all sorts of opportunities that are out before us. And I suppose that picture there is a great picture, probably to represent the modern opportunities of Syria, the city of New York. And it represents everything that the world can give us, doesn't it? Like the career opportunities, and you can be an entrepreneur and do this, and you can be in business, or you can achieve this or that. And the world says, this is it. The world's your oyster. It's right in front of you. And that's where Jacob is. And he sees and is excited about the opportunities that Syria presents for him. They're right in front of him. And he gets met, when he arrives there, he gets met by this man Laban. And we meet him in verse 13. So Rachel, she runs home and tells this man Laban that he's arrived, this man Jacob. And we meet this man Laban in verse 13. It says, "And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob his sister's son, that he ran to meet him, and he embraced him, and he kissed him, and he brought him into his house, and told Laban all these things." So Rachel returns home to her father, and she tells Laban that Jacob is here. And this man Laban, as soon as he hears about Jacob, he runs as fast as he possibly can to this man Jacob, and he greets him, and he hugs him, and he kisses this man Jacob. He's so excited to see him. Now, he comes across, doesn't he, immediately when we see him, as a very charismatic, friendly, inviting, great guy, this man Laban. But we're going to come to know Laban a little bit as we go through this story, and to see what Laban was really like. Now, the Bible calls him, or refers to him as Laban the Syrian on a number of occasions, all right? He refers to, when they talks about Laban, it says Laban the Syrian. And what God's trying to tell us is this man is like a personification of everything that Syria represents. He's a personification of everything the world represents. It's in this man Laban. And we've put some points there to describe the kind of man that he was. The first thing we know about Laban was that he was driven by money. That was the motivating force in his life. Let's just go to Genesis chapter 24, verse 29. This is when we first meet him. And this is when his sister actually leaves, or when Abraham's servant first comes to meet this family. And in verse 29, we read what happens. Well, verse 28, it says, "And the damsel ran and told them of her mother's house, of her mother's house these things. And Rebekah had a brother, and his name was Laban. And Laban ran out unto the man," this is Eliezer, "unto the well." So he does the same thing. "And it came to pass, when he saw the earrings and the bracelets upon his sister's hands, and when he heard the words of Rebekah his sister, saying, Thus spake this man unto me, that he came unto the man, and beheld, and he stood by the camels at the well, and he said, Come in thou, blessed of the Lord, wherefore standest thou without? For I have prepared the house and a room for thy camels." So when Rebekah comes, and this man Laban runs out to greet her, when he saw the jewels that were in her ears, and the necklaces that were around her neck, and the bracelets around her hands that were covered in jewels and diamonds and beautiful gold, this man thought, this girl is brilliant. we got to get this man into our house now. And so all of a sudden he was out with the catering, right? He said, yes, we can look after the camels, we can do all this stuff. And this man is driven by money. And 77 years later, because that's how many years it is later, when this man Jacob rolls into his house, 77 years later, he hasn't forgotten about those jewels. And as soon as he hears that Jacob is come back, and he's from the rich family of Abraham, their cousins, he runs out as fast as he can and he hugs that man Jacob and welcomes into his house. He was a man that was driven by money. The other thing he was a hard taskmaster. He's going to work Jacob to the bone. He's going to extract every last piece of sweat out of Jacob over the next 40 years. And all for his own benefit, he hoped. So he's a hard taskmaster. He's also deceptive and manipulative. And we'll see that in a minute in the story with his daughters. Deceptive and manipulative. He's also selfish and cruel. Let's just have a look at this one. Genesis chapter 31. This is what he does against his own daughters. This is when Jacob wants to leave. He wants to get out of Laban's household, and he's telling his wives what Laban's like. And Laban's two daughters reply, and they say to Jacob, and this is about their own father, verse 14 and 15. And Jacob and Leah answered and said unto him, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? For he has sold us and has quite devoured also all our money. So Laban's the kind of man, he's so selfish that even his own daughter's inheritance, he somehow works out a way where he can have it for himself. He's selfish and cruel, even to his own family, because all he cares about, ultimately, is himself. That's our man Laban. He's also an idolater. We know that because he chases after Jacob and accuses him of taking his idols. And he's angry and violent when things don't go his way. So he appears all beautiful to Jacob. He's all friendly, welcoming in the house. But when things turn against Laban, he's prepared to go and kill Jacob. And he gets angry and he gets violent. And God says, that's, in a nutshell, what Syria is like. Laban the Syrian. And maybe you've experienced, maybe it's not to the extremity of some of the things of Laban, but maybe you've experienced that sentiment in some of the dealings you've had in your life, in work, or in business, or at school, or at different places that you've come across. I know in my own life I've seen similar things and similar traits. And that's what Laban's like. And he greets Jacob with a real hearty kiss and hug. And look what he says to Jacob. Let's go back to chapter 29. Verse 14. Once he's cuddled Jacob, he says to him, and Laban said to him, surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. So he hugged this man Jacob, and he said to him, he looked into his eyes and he said, surely, Jacob, you are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Now the Hebrew for that expression is, surely, Jacob, you are the self-same person as me. You're just like me, Jacob. And I welcome you into my house, and I'm going to turn you to be just like me, because we're cousins, we're brothers. And you're just the same as me. And Jacob would see himself in Laban. It would highlight to Jacob, when he looked at Laban and some of the things that happened to him with Laban in his life, it would highlight to Jacob himself some of his own darker characteristics of his life. And he would have to make a choice, Jacob, whether he would become like Laban or whether he would choose to become something different. Because Jacob certainly had the possibility of turning out exactly the same as his uncle Laban. And it said there he abode there about the space of a month. Now, his mother was wise, wasn't she? When she was asked, just stay here for a week with us, she said, I'll leave tomorrow. And she left with the servant of Abraham, and she went and she joined her husband Isaac. But Jacob stayed a month. And that month turned into 7 years, and then another 7 years, and then eventually 40 years in the service of that man Laban. Such was the hard taskmastership of that man Laban. So Jacob joins with Laban, and verse 15 says, and Laban said unto Jacob, because thou art my brother, shouldest thou therefore not serve me for naught? Tell me what your wages should be. What should I pay you, Jacob, for you to serve with me in my house? Now, Jacob had already noticed that Laban had a beautiful daughter. And now he notices both daughters, and they're introduced to us in verse 16. And both of these women catch Jacob's eye. And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And it's interesting that elder and younger are used as expressions in that verse, aren't they? Because they're the same expressions used of Isaac and Jacob. I mean, Esau and Jacob. The older and younger. And here we have another family where there's 2 daughters this time, not 2 sons. And there's an older and there's a younger. And they're both, just like Jacob and Esau, they're both very different people. And we're told what different people they are in verse 17. Leah was tender-eyed. Another translation has it that she was delicate of eye. And I don't think that that means that she was unattractive. But I think that that means that her attractiveness was in her eyes and spoke of a depth of character that was the beauty of this woman. That's what shined out about Leah. She had a beautiful depth of character. And she turns out to be the spiritual one of those 2 women. And she stands in contrast to her sister, who we are told Rachel was beautiful and well favoured. Another translation, the ESV, says she was beautiful in form and in appearance. So she had an amazing face and a beautiful body. She had absolutely everything. She was gorgeous. And Jacob is drawn to Rachel. Verse 18. And Jacob loved Rachel. And in doing so, he made the same mistake as his dad, didn't he? He fell into the same mistake as his dad. He saw Rachel and the outward appearance and the beauty and the form, and she was really cute and gorgeous and beautiful, and that's all he saw. And he completely ignored Leah. And that's what his dad had done. And he loved Rachel because of those fleshly things that were attractive about her. He loved her. And so beautiful was she that he, without even thinking, in verse 18, it says, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel. Doesn't even think, just says, I don't care how much it is, 7 years I'll serve you. She's so beautiful. Now, Laban just couldn't believe his luck, right? Because he was a man that liked to strike a good deal. And as soon as he heard that, he stitches up the deal immediately. Verse 19, and Laban said, "It is better that I give her to thee than I should give her to anyone else. Abide with me." And she came into the house, and he served in Laban's house for 7 years for this woman, Rachel. And verse 20 says that those years to Jacob were like nothing because of the love he had for that woman. Now, it wasn't because those 7 years weren't hard, because they were hard. He would have worked very hard in the house of Laban for those 7 years, but he loved Rachel so much that they seemed to him like nothing. And then finally, the day comes that he's going to be given unto this woman, Rachel. And you sort of get the inference in verse 21 that he has served hard 7 years for this woman. And finally, those days have been up, and he comes to Laban and he says, right, verse 21, Jacob said unto Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. Okay, Laban, I've served you 7 years. I've worked very, very hard for you. I want my wife now." Now, Laban's going to set Jacob up in a terrible act of deceit. He's going to stitch this man up. And the worst thing about what Laban does to Jacob is the humiliation this would have put this man through. Because look what he says in verse 22, and he knows exactly what he's going to do. And Laban gathered together all the men of that place at the feast. So he goes and tells everyone in his city and all the people, all his friends, and all the men of the city, and he brings them to this feast. And no doubt he told all of those people exactly what was going to happen, and everyone was in on the joke. Everyone knew what Laban was going to do that night, except for Jacob. And he was going to be made to look like an absolute fool in this situation. And so they have the wedding feast. And there would have been drinking, and there would have been celebration and a great feast, as it says at the end of verse 22. And then Laban puts his plan into action, verse 23. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and he brought her to him, and he went in unto her. Now, was Leah part of the conspiracy? Well, obviously she would have known about it. And perhaps it was her fault. It could have been better in this. But I kind of think, when you look at the situation of her family with Laban, that she was probably given no choice in this situation but to go along with her father's plan. And how was it that she could go into Jacob and he could never know or never recognise that it was actually Leah? Well, the sort of customs of the day say that the brides at that particular time would have been heavily disguised in veil. And so this woman, Leah, the older sister of the two, goes into that tent heavily disguised to deceive Jacob. And how the irony in that someone should come to him in full disguise and to deceive him. Because that's what he'd done to his dad, hadn't it? And now the same thing is happening to him. And so Leah goes in unto him. And the next morning, Jacob wakes. And he's absolutely filthy, as you would be. He served 7 years of honest service. And he's been completely ripped off. And he's humiliated as well, isn't he? Verse 25, and it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, he would have stormed out of that tent, wouldn't he? He would have marched straight up to Laban. And he points his finger at him and he says, "What is this that thou hast done unto me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? I've been honest. Wherefore have you beguiled me?" Completely humiliated, and probably all the other men were there, probably laughing at what had happened. And Laban then says this, And these would have been cutting words for Jacob. Verse 26. And Laban said, "It must not be so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." And isn't that what Jacob had done in his country? He'd deceived his father, and by that deception, he had been blessed as the younger above the older. And it's just so specifically written there that I think Laban must have known. And somehow the story got out. He's been there for 7 years. And somehow the story came from the other family down south. And they knew about what had happened to Esau. And they knew the deception that Jacob had done to Esau. And now Laban says, well, you did it. But we don't do that here in our country. And I think Jacob would have got the point. And he would have thought about his own deception of his own brother and his own father. And perhaps for the first time, he really thought about the gravity of what he'd done to his own family. Because now it's being done to him. And that would have hurt Jacob. Now, how does he react to this? This is the situations in life that probably matter the most, don't they? When we're under this kind of pressure and we have to react to a certain situation. And I think it shows the character of a person in what their reaction is. It would have been so easy under the humiliating circumstances that Jacob faced. Like, what would you have done if someone did that to you? How would you feel if someone had did that to you? I tell you the way I would feel. I would think, I will never trust you again, and the first opportunity I get to double cross you, that's what I'm going to do. I'm never going to work for you again, and I'm certainly not going to work as hard as what I have for you from this point forward. He could have thought that, couldn't he? And he probably could have justified it in his own mind. But he had a decision to make here, in this moment. Am I going to become like Laban? Or am I going to stand above that behaviour? And I think what Jacob decided to do, and this is a measure of the man that he would become, is he decides to be different from him. You look at chapter 31, verse 38. When he talks to Laban when he's finally leaving him, he says to Laban in verse 38, 20 years have I been with you, and this is the kind of honest service I made. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. I was honest, Laban. That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it myself. And my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. And I think Jacob made a determination in his mind after what happened to him in that deceit, when he realised the deceptive ways that he had treated his own brother and his own father, that I'm going to be different from that now. And from this point on in his service with Laban, as he had for the previous 7 years, he's honest. He's righteous. And behind Laban's back even, when he could have, he was miles away from the house and he's with those ewe lambs and he's all by himself and he could have done whatever he wanted with Laban's stuff. He was honest. And he made a decision. I don't want to be like that. I could see what I was like. And I can see in that man Laban what I was turning into. And I don't want to be like that anymore. It's easy, isn't it, brothers and sisters, to get sucked into the ways of Syria and to become like them and to be ruthless and to be dishonest just to get what they're trying to get as well. And that's one of the decisions that we will have to make in life as we grow, and particularly probably as we, perfectly relatable in our careers and what we want to try and attain for and strive for. We'll have to make those decisions. Do I want to become absolutely ruthless like this man Laban and go and get what I want at all other costs? Or do I want to at some point say, that's not what I want for me and my family? And I think Jacob starts to make those decisions in his life at this point. Now, Laban then presents him with another offer, and this sort of reveals to him in verse 27 what he was really trying to do in this whole deceptive stitch-up. He'd realised how much of a great worker Jacob was, and he wanted to keep this man Jacob on for as much as possible. And so he's got him in his trap now. Verse 27, he says, okay, Jacob, I get that you're angry. This is my deal for you. Fulfill her week, and we will give you also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet another 7 years. Just give me another 7 years, Jacob, and you can have Rachel as well. And I'll give it to you now. But I need your service for another 7 years. And that's what Laban was after. He was after the service of this man Jacob. Now, Jacob, I suppose, at this point had a choice to make, didn't he? Just like Isaac had the choice to make. Remember, Isaac was put in the position where he needed to make the choice. And God had shown him what that choice should be. And he could have chosen to just give it to Esau anyway, or to give the blessing to Jacob. And Jacob's now got that same choice. He's seen now that God has worked in his life, and he has given to him the wife Leah and not Rachel. And he could decide at this point what he wants to do. He would have been far better to take Leah and recognise that she was the wife that God had given to her because she was the spiritual one. To take her and to say, no thank you, Laban, and return to his father's house. He would have been far better to do that. And he would have agonised over that choice. But in the end, he comes to Laban and he says, I want Rachel. I want Rachel. And Laban says, you can have her. And he secured another 7-year contract with that woman. And it goes on to tell us about the relationships of these two women. Jacob did so. And then in verse 30 it says, and he went in also unto Rachel. So he gives her the wife that he wanted so desperately. And he loved also Rachel more than Leah. And he served with him 7 other years. So he takes that woman Rachel into his house. And he loved that woman Rachel. And the record says he loved her more than Leah. Now he's done exactly what his dad did to him to his own wives. We talked about that last night, didn't we? About how much that would have hurt Jacob when he saw his dad, who loved his brother, and for everything he had and all the physical prowess that he had, he loved him, and Jacob would have hated that he showed favouritism to Esau and not to him. And he goes and does the exact same thing to Leah. And Leah was like him, wasn't she? She was the spiritual one. She was the one that could actually see the big issues of life. And what was really important, that was Leah. And Rachel, for a lot of the time, was all after her own selfish wants and needs. Yet he loved Rachel. And Leah was often left on the sidelines. And that created in his family so much tension. God said in Leviticus, later on in the law, he said, don't take a wife that are sisters, lest it vex her. And it vexed Leah. Because all she wanted was for her husband to love her. And the decision that Jacob makes at this point, the choice that he makes, causes all sorts of trouble in his family that he had to then deal with. There was envying and jealousy. Look at verse 1 of chapter 30, and it says, "And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Jacob envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children or I die." So there was this tension that immediately started in the household between these two wives. And there's Jacob right in the meat between the sandwich, all because of the choice that he'd made. And he was having to then try and balance it out and contend with all the stuff that's going on, and the fighting and the infighting that was happening. There were family issues and infighting between the families. And they used their children, when the children were born, as weapons, against the other one. And that's often depicted in the names that they give them to the children. Dan, for example, is judging. It was named Judge because it's like, God's judged you for what you've done to me. Or Levi was about being joined to Jacob. And Naphtali means wrestlings because Rachel said, God has seen the wrestlings that I've had with my sister and he's delivered them, right? So they used the naming of the children to actually fight as a weapon against their sister. And all this was happening in the family of Jacob. Now, I remember a situation in my own life where this, not that happened to me, but happened to someone I know that almost maps out this exactly, where names were used as weapons, and it just destroyed the family or made living in that family incredibly hard. And it happened to my first boss that I ever had. This is going back 20 years ago, early 2000s, late 90s. And this boss, who I got on really well with, he's probably 10 years older than me. He came into the office one day and he looked really stressed, and he was like a really easygoing guy, and he was really stressed. And I said to him, what's happened? What's wrong? He's like, "Oh, you're not going to be able to believe what's happened in my family. It's just ripping us apart." I was like, "Oh my goodness, what's happened?" And he said, "Well, it's a long story, and it's an unbelievable story." But he said, my brother married my wife's sister. So it's two brothers who both married sisters, to women that were sisters. And he said over the course of time, of course, what happened was one of them became pregnant. And then the other one became pregnant. And as women do, they talked about baby names, right? Discussing baby names, if my baby is going to be is born, this is what I want, and this is what it's going to be called, right? So the time finally arrives. And not my boss, but his brother, his wife, gives birth to a beautiful boy. And she names him Nicholas Fox. 2 weeks later, my boss's wife gives birth to an equally beautiful boy. And she had told the previous sister that the name that she was going to name her child, if it was a boy, was Nicholas Fox. And so when that day finally came 2 weeks later and she had a little boy, you know what she named that boy? Nicholas Fox. Two Nicholas Foxes. Now this is quite a few years before what's happening right now when my boss comes in. And he says, "You're not going to believe what's happened. 2 weeks ago, my wife gave birth to a little boy. And we called him William Fox. And last night, my brother's wife also had a little boy. And you know what she's named him? William Fox." That is a true story. 2 Nicholas Foxes and 2 William Foxes in the same family. Absolutely unbelievable. And all because of this jealousy and tension that was going on. You imagine what that would be like at Christmas time or birthdays and things like that. You got 2 Nicholas Foxes, you got 2 Williams Foxes. It would be unbelievable, okay? That's a real life story. And that's kind of what's happening here with Jacob. He's got this kind of behaviour going on with his jealousies and hatreds, and people are naming things after other things, and all these types of things are going on in the family of Jacob. And Jacob's having to deal with this. And then it got worse, didn't it, when the handmaidens were brought into it. Bilhah and Zilpah. And they brought their own problems into the situation. And Jacob had to deal with them as well. And he was trying to juggle life at the same time. And all while this is going on, he's facing the daily struggles of working for Laban. Let's just go to chapter 31 again in verse 40 and 41, which we did also already read, but let's just emphasise it again. Verse 40 and 41 of Genesis chapter 31. This is the life that Jacob is leading. Under Laban. And I was in the day, the drought consumed me. So this is life working for Laban. And frost by night. And my sleep departed from my eyes. So he was working all while this is going on at home. He's out there slogging his guts out, working so many long hours for this man. He's up early in the morning, and sometimes he doesn't even come home because he's looking after Laban's flock. He's out there in the field, working day in, day out for this deceptive boss. And verse 41, this is how his boss treats him. And thus I have been 20 years in your house, and I served thee 14 years for 2 daughters and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. So you've extracted me. And I guarantee the 10 times that he talks about his wages were changed were not like they were going up, okay? 10 times you reviewed my package and you said, we've got to bring it down a little bit, Jacob. And Laban is extracting out of this man, Jacob, everything he possibly can. And that's the life that Jacob is leading in Syria. And after 35 years, Jacob starts to reflect upon that life. And he thinks about how he came to Syria and the opportunities that Syria presented to him and all the great things that he was going to do and it was going to give to him. And now he sees the reality of what Syria really was. And he sees trouble, and he sees vexation, and he sees problems. And perhaps he even thought similar to what Solomon did in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 22 to 23. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also vanity. And I can imagine Jacob thinking similar thoughts to those as he thought about now life in Syria and the hardness of that life and the realities of life in Syria. And I think for myself, the older I get, I feel those sentiments. Because life in Syria at times is hard. With trying to raise a family, with working like this world wants us to work these days, hours after hour to keep up with the expectation of what this world wants us to have and be like, it becomes harder and harder and harder. And that man started to feel that way. He started to feel that way about life in Syria. Now, the point of that verse and the whole of Ecclesiastes really is, and when Solomon was reflecting upon it, was that's how life in Syria feels when you don't have God. When you're working in this world and that cycle of work and process of going through day after day, if you don't have God in that life, it's empty. It's like vapour. And Jacob started to feel this way about his life. And he started to think about home. He started to think about his dad. And he started to think about his grandpa. And he started to think about everything that their life stood for. He started to think about the truth. He started to think about the simple sojourning life that his dad and his grandfather had left. And he started to think, that's what I want. That's the way I want to live. Look what Jacob says in chapter 30 and verse 25 and 26. It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, and that relieved probably a lot of stress in the family because it took a long time for Rachel to have a child. And when she finally had that child, it says, and Jacob said unto Laban, send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Jacob reaches the point here, doesn't he, where he looks at Syria and everything that Syria has to offer and the hard-paced lifestyle that that life gives. And he says, I don't want it. I'm sick of it. I don't want that life. I don't want to be like Laban. I don't be working to the bone, all for nothing. I don't want that life. I want to go to my country. I want to go to my place. I want to go to that simple life of sojourning. I want to go back to that country which my God promised to my grandpa and to my father. That's me. That's what I want. And God, brothers and sisters, wants us all to be brought to that point in life, doesn't he? We'll all go through the cycle of living in Syria and perhaps the aspirations of what that can give us in life and all the dreams that that could have. And it's not like work should not be enjoyable. And Solomon talks about that in Ecclesiastes, doesn't he? He says there are rewards for working hard and there are rewards for diligent work, and we can enjoy that. But the overwhelming principle that Solomon presents is if you don't have God, then it's all just a waste of time. It's like a passing vapour. And that's how Jacob feels. And he says to Laban, I want to go home. And he struggles a bit with Laban in the next chapter, and there's a deal that's made, but eventually God says, it's time to go, Jacob. And Jacob, in the dead of night of chapter 31, packs his bags and he packs his kids and he gets all his stuff, and in the dead of night he sets off to get away from Syria. And finally he makes his way, after 40 years, he makes his way home to his real family. And Jacob had learnt a lot in those 40 years, hadn't he? He'd learnt so much. He'd learnt a lot about himself. He'd learnt about his past deceptive ways. He'd learnt that it was time to be honest. He'd thought about the way he had treated people in the past and realised how bad that treatment actually was, and thought, I don't want to treat people like that anymore. He'd thought about some of the choices that he had made, and how the choices that he had made on some occasions had led to disastrous circumstances. And sometimes we make the same choices. and we have to live with those choices. But he had seen Laban, brothers and sisters, for who he really was. He had seen Syria for what it really was and what it was really offering to him. And when that was finally offered to that man Jacob, he said, I don't want it. And he chose a different pathway. And that was God's pathway. And God was leading this man, wasn't he? He was guiding this man. He was developing his character, as he does with ours, every step of the way. And this man Jacob leaves as well a lot more humble. You remember how he came to Laban? Full of confidence, right? He was the man, he's going to achieve this, he's telling people what to do. Well, he's learnt so much in his life, and he leads a humble man, thinking about all the things that have happened to him in his life. And the next lesson God is going to teach him in tomorrow's study is that even though now he's humble, he's ready to start putting his confidence and his trust in the real power of his life, the God of Abraham. And he's going to learn how to grasp hold of that God, and for that God to be the power and direction in his life, as he needs to be in all of our lives. And Jacob's going to come to that lesson tomorrow, as he comes to rely completely and utterly upon his God.